Hey guys, hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to talk about the second part to the Mr. McMahon documentary, part two, entitled. Let's see, I forgot the title. Entitled Heat. Heat, and it's an aptly titled name because that's exactly what we're getting here. Heat. We talked before in the previous video about part one. Part one was Junior. We talked a little bit about Vince McMahon's rise to power, him taking over all the other territories, his relationship with his father, whom we met when he first met when he was 12 years old. It didn't really delve into his relationship with his pops all that much, but we got from it that his father was a really cold person. He never hugged him. In fact, he never saw him for 12 years, the first 12 years of his life. And when he finally saw him, all Vince got was a pat on the head. He didn't even get the hug he envisioned. But anyway, that Vince became enamored with the world of professional wrestling. Oh, David Roscoe. Okay, you watched it last Wednesday. What did you think, Dave? Uh, that he was enamored with this world of professional wrestling, and he wanted to become a part of the professional wrestling business. He does that, and he becomes the most successful promoter in wrestling in the 1980s, beginning in the early 1980s, taking over all the territories and becoming the biggest thing since sliced bread in wrestling. They talk about Hulk Hogan, how Hulk Hogan was introduced. Now, in part two, it begins with Vince McMahon saying, "Stand back." This was a performance that he did at the Slammies, the Slammy Awards in 1987. Many people have seen it. The WWF released two musical albums. One was Pile Driver album, and the other one was WWF The Album in the 1980s. And this is where Stand Back was a part of. It's just really hilarious to see. So what they go into are in this one are the scandals, the various scandals, the Ring Boy scandal involving Pat Patterson and Mel Phillips, um, child molestation allegations. They go into yeah. David says he watched all six parts of the McMahon documentary. Again, what did you think, Dave? We didn't get to on this channel. We're just talking about part two here. So um, we're taking it slow. But anyway, the Ring Boy scandal. There were allegations in the early 1990s about, and we talked a lot about it on this channel, especially when Vince McMahon, when Pat Patterson passed away. There were allegations that Pat Patterson and Mel Phillips and another wrestler, um, Terry Garvin, had inappropriate relationships with ring boys, and that Vince knew about it. Then there were allegations that Vince himself re- sexually assaulted a woman named Rita Chatterton, aka Rita Marie, the first female referee in the 80s. Then there were allegations um, of steroid distribution. Vince McMahon in the early 1980s had hired this individual named George Sahorian, a doctor out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, uh, because that's where they used to do the TV tapings in Pennsylvania, in Harrisburg. And he'd hired this individual, and the individual allegedly distributed steroids to the wrestlers. And in the early 1990s, this came to be. So basically, it chronicles the rise of WWE, this chapter, from how they exploded. Dave Meltzer is featured in this episode. He talks about how in 1984 and 85, WWE was the biggest thing going. But with all these scandals, first with Hulk Hogan, people getting tired of Hulk Hogan, they talk about the rise of the Ultimate Warrior. And now the Ultimate Warrior, how they positioned the Ultimate Warrior to surpass Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 6. Vince had surmised that fans were getting tired of Hogan and they wanted something different. So they thought that Hogan could. Okay. They thought that they could. Um, that they could surpass Hogan, and Hogan could pass the torch to somebody else, like Andre the Giant passed the torch to him. So they have the match at WrestleMania 6. It's a success, and like someone, I forgot who it was in the documentary. I think it was Bruce Pritchard said, well, the Ultimate Warrior is popular, but he wasn't as popular as Hulk Hogan. So Warrior carries the torch for most of 1990, and then at the Royal Rumble in 1991, he loses it to Sergeant Slaughter. Then they talk about the Sergeant Slaughter storyline. We talked a lot about this on this channel. All this stuff, the fall of the WWF, how people reacted to the Sergeant Slaughter storyline, the storyline that Sergeant Slaughter was an Iraqi sympathizer. Now, when they started the storyline, the United States had not gone to war with Kuwait. But in the middle of the storyline leading up to WrestleMania 7, the United States did go to war with Kuwait because Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait, a sovereign nation. So people seeing this storyline of Sergeant Slaughter had a visceral reaction to it, including Bob Costas, who was supposed to be a celebrity guest at WrestleMania that year. He talks about, and keep in mind, Bob Costas was a ring announcer for one of the events of Hulk Hogan versus the Hulk Hogan versus Paul Orndorff match in '86. So he was a fan of wrestling. He was involved with them in the '80s. But he says that the wrestling of the mid '80s was lighthearted, was fun, but it was taking a turn in the 1990s to something more sinister. And this is what he was referring to. This is the reason why he backed out of his participation at WrestleMania 7, and so did Roseanne Barr, who in 1991, Roseanne Barr had the most successful television show on TV at that time, the Roseanne Show. So she would have been a huge coup for them to get at WrestleMania 7. In fact, there's an episode of Roseanne where she references DJ, her son, getting tickets to WrestleMania. And I think they were going to try to tie it in, the Roseanne show and WrestleMania, but it just didn't come to be because she backed out. So everyone is basically not wanting to be associated with the WWF anymore. And even though Hogan triumphs and becomes the WWF champion once again for the third time at WrestleMania 7, it's not enough because fans began to turn on Hulk Hogan because of the steroid allegations, because of the Sergeant Slaughter Iraqi storyline. Hogan talks about he would go into arenas and people would say, they used to hold up Hulk rules signs, and now they say, Hulk, have you taken your shot today? So the fans are starting to turn, and they show the footage of the Royal Rumble 1992, and we talked about it before in this channel. In 1992, it came down to Randy Savage, Sid, and the Ultimate Warrior. Randy Savage, Sid, and Hulk Hogan, and Hogan is eliminated by Sid in the Royal Rumble. This is for the WWF Championship, and Ric Flair's Randy Savage, Ric Flair, Sid, and Hulk Hogan. Those four, Royal Rumble 1992. And what happens? Hogan pulls Sid down, and the people cheer for Hogan being eliminated, and they boo him when he pulls Sid down. But WWE did some through the magic of editing. WWE edited out the boos, but basically the fans were turning on Hulk Hogan. But Vince him says that he never perceived Hulk Hogan as a heel, so he never wanted to turn Hulk Hogan to a heel. He wanted to keep him as a babyface. And then uh, they show footage of the trial. They say that Hulk Hogan. Okay, we get to like 1993, 1994. Hulk Hogan leaves the WWF, going to WCW in 1994, and I remember this vividly. I remember the trial vividly, and I remember when they called Hulk Hogan to the stand. To testify against Vince. And they thought this was a smoking gun. They're figuring he left this company, he went to this rival promotion working for WCW. Of course, he's going to testify against his old boss, right? He doesn't. He tells him that Vince had nothing to do with him taking steroids, right? And then there's a funny scene in the documentary where Tony Atlas is interviewed. And they asked Tony Atlas, they said, well, if you saw something going on inappropriate, sex wise, at the arena, why didn't you tell somebody? And he goes, well, who was I going to tell? You know, Vince was going to look at me and look at Pat Patterson, and he's going to want to keep Pat Patterson because that was his right-hand man. That was his booker. And he's going to look at me and want to fire me. Who am I going to tell? He's telling the interviewer, like, you don't understand how the wrestling business works. Like the amount of nepotism involved with the wrestling business. Now, the people on the panel, when it comes to the Pat Patterson situation, they try to make it like the government was targeting Pat Patterson, and the accusers were targeting Pat Patterson only because he was gay. Like he was getting thrown onto like it was a homophobic witch hunt. And they didn't have anything really on Pat. And I'm thinking in my mind, I'm like, if only Roddy Piper were alive today, because there's an interview with Roddy Piper on kayfabe commentaries talking about when he was a youngster in the business with Pat Patterson, when Pat Patterson was on top in the San Francisco territory in the 70s. And he basically alludes to Pat Patterson doing stuff for him that was inappropriate. And I'm thinking like, no, we're not, people are not accusing Patterson of doing that stuff because he's gay. Don't try to make it like it's some homophobic stuff. It's kind of like how I always say, like, if a person is against Israel, automatically they're conflated as anti-Semitic when that might not even be the case. They might have legitimate gripes against Israel, or if they're automatically against something, an organization like Black Lives Matter, because they feel like it's a Marxist front organization, or it embezzles its followers' money, they're automatically racist. Like that's the way they try to make it with this. Like the people that were accusing Pat Patterson were automatically homophobic and only accusing him because he's gay and not because he actually did this stuff. Like this actually went on, and Vince covered it up. You know what I'm saying? Because, I mean, yes, he was in a long-term relationship, Pat Patterson, with Louis Dondero, a hairstylist, for years. But he also, was noted to make, advances towards male wrestlers, particularly Barry O, Randy Orton's uncle, was one of the people on the Phil Donahue show accusing higher ups in the WWF organization, and the higher up they're talking about is Pat Patterson. Now it's not because he's gay; it was because he really did this crazy bullshit. He really was involved in sexual misconduct with wrestlers. I don't know about underage, underage boys, but That's what these guys were accused of. And you had wrestlers like Bruno Sammartino and superstar Billy Graham come on the Phil Donahue show accusing Vince. Dave Meltzer was there. It's a famous clip. But anyway, they show Vince with a neck brace beating the allegations because they said that there was really no evidence that Vince, distributed steroids or knew about. He wasn't taking a trial for the sexual molestation stuff, but that he knew about, um, that he knew about the steroids. So he beats the charges, and then they talk about the rise of WCW during that time, how WCW had existed. Uh, Eric Bischoff says they weren't just second place; they were like 200th place. That's how far behind they were. Showing gimmicks like Oz, gimmicks like Vinny Vegas, gimmicks like Van Hammer, stuff that was associated with WCW in the early '90s. And people know, wrestling fans, longtime wrestling fans, know the history behind how Ted Turner came to own WCW. Basically, they don't really go into it all that much, but basically, it's like this. Um, Georgia Championship Wrestling existed for since the 50s, owned originally by a guy named Jerry Oates. And then um, through a relationship with Ted Turner, as he was launching his superstation, wrestling became really successful in his superstation in the early 1970s. And then Georgia Championship Wrestling started to expand to other markets. And Vince McMahon was also expanding at that time. And in 1984, he bought Georgia Championship Wrestling from uh, Jack and Jerry Briscoe, who were part owners of it at that time, but he didn't buy Ole Anderson's share because Ole Anderson refused to do business with him. And then Vince, uh, on an episode of World Championship Wrestling, which was Georgia Championship Wrestling's flagship show, appears and basically takes over, and the people that were longtime viewers of Georgia Championship Wrestling complain, hey, where's Gordon Soley, where's our old school wrestlers? Now we're seeing a bunch of WWF wrestlers, and the ratings tank, and Ted Turner forces Vince off the station, and Vince has to sell to the promoter in the Carolinas, Jim Crockett Jr., and that's when the Crockett territory gets that national spot, and Jim Crockett Promotions, make a run for it with all the Starcades and Dusty Rhodes' booking and everything. But in 1988, 4 years later, they go broke, and they have a choice to either sell to Vince McMahon or sell to Ted Turner, who's interested in getting involved in the wrestling business. They ultimately choose to sell to Ted Turner, and Ted Turner then tries to compete with Vince McMahon, but doesn't have the expertise. Originally hires Jim Herd. Jim Herd in the in the in the late 80s and early 90s runs off a lot of wrestlers, including the Road Warriors, including Ric Flair, wrestlers that were really successful and integral parts of Jim Crockett Promotions get run off, and they go to the WWF. And then they bring in Bill Watts, who was the former promoter in the UWF / Mid-South territory, which was a huge promotion based out of Louisiana in the mid 80s. But his organization went belly up in 1987 due to the oil recession in those states, and he comes in as the head of WCW in 1992. And his idea is to finally air old footage of Ric Flair in the company, even though Ric Flair's in WWF at this time, and it gets huge ratings. So when Ric Flair's contract is up in early 1993, they bring Flair back. But they end up firing Bill Watts because of comments that he made in the Torch to an individual named Wade Keller about that were racially insensitive, racist stuff, racist and homophobic stuff. It gets leaked out by this journalist, Mark Madden, and they fire Bill Watts. So when they fired Bill Watts, Eric Bischoff, who used to work for Vern Gagne, who was underneath an underneath guy for Vern Gagne, an announcer for Vern Gagne, started off in the Minnesota territory with Sonny Ono selling um, Ninja Stars, those Ninja Star things, and they call it Ninja Star Wars. Right? Nothing to do with the sci-fi franchise, but Ninja Star Wars, and they were selling it to Vince. I mean, selling it to Vern, and Vern decides to hire him because the old announcer Larry Nelson, left the promotion, and that's how Eric Bischoff got into the wrestling business in in the mid 1980s. But Vern Gagne closed his doors in 1991. Eric Bischoff needed a job. He went to go audition for Vince McMahon. Vince McMahon says no, so then he goes to WCW. So he's already in WCW by the time they need a new executive producer because they're done with wrestling people. They had a lot of wrestling people that they dealt with in the past. Ole Anderson, Dusty Rhodes, Bill Watts, and they're done with those wrestling people. They want a new, fresh face. And since Eric Bischoff had some experience in marketing and advertising, dealing with television people, and was real close friends with Jason Hervey, the brother from the Wonder Years, they figured, hey, why not take a chance on him? DDP, who was in the promotion at that time, advocated for him, and they took a chance on him. And in late 1993, he was hired by them. He then took over in WCW, and of course, he brought Kevin Sullivan in that did most of his booking. So that's where we're at now, where Eric Bischoff is starting to make the changes in WCW that needed to be made. Number one, moving WCW out of its southern-based location, because even though WCW, after Ted bought it in 1988, was a national promotion, it was still perceived by many as a regional southern promotion. A lot of the major events in WCW were held in southern arenas. The Greensboro Coliseum, the Omni in Atlanta, Tupelo, Mississippi, Biloxi, Mississippi. The real deep South was the core fan base of WCW, but he wanted to change that, so he moves the tapings to the Disney MGM studios. That's what they get to, and then he begins to the connection of Ric Flair to get in contact with Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan had left the WWF. Vince said that Hogan was getting too old, and he wanted to really this time for real, move on from Hogan and move to more newer stars. Part of the reason too was because of the steroid trial. Hogan was the public face of the company during the steroid era, and they figured, well, we can't continue to still have him around. So what are we going to do? We'll put in smaller, more athletic talent like Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, which is they become the face of the new marketing slogan, the new generation. But where does that leave guys like Hogan? He wants to just work on his television show, Thunder in Paradise, that does tapings at Disney MGM. But through Ric Flair, they persuade him to come to WCW. And July of 1994, he has his first WCW match for the WCW Championship in Orlando against Ric Flair. And it's a huge event. Shaq is there. Shaq was just in the NBA Finals that year with playing for the Orlando Magic. You know what I mean? So, they eventually get Muhammad Ali involved. In other months down the road, because him and Ric Flair have 3 matches. And they talk about the rise of WCW and how WWE is trying to rebrand themselves as the new generation and the struggles that WWE is having, trying to do that. Because, like I said, they tried to do, and I've said this in other videos, they tried to do the transition too fast. You know what I mean? On the one hand, like back then, WWE only had 4 pay-per-views. So your last pay-per-view was headlined in the world title, WWF World Title match with the Ultimate Warrior versus Randy Savage in Wembley Stadium. It was headlined with Bret Hart and British Bulldog. That's true, the main event, but that was a special case because it was England, and the British Bulldog is an English wrestler, right? But in the world title scene, it was the Ultimate Warrior and Randy Savage. You can't just move from that it's at SummerSlam all the way and do a 360, and then your next pay per view is headlined by Shawn Michaels as the Intercontinental Champion and Bret Hart as the WWF Champion. It doesn't make sense. Fans are not used to seeing Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels in that sort of light as main event talents. And when Bret Hart won the title from Ric Flair, it just came out of nowhere. It was a random house show in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Like, it wasn't even a televised match. It made no sense. So fans are not used to Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. They'll get used to those guys and the Razor Ramones and the Diesels and all that. They'll get used to those guys much, much later. But at first, they really weren't. And that's why ratings started to tank. And plus, they relied heavily on the gimmicks. Too many occupation style gimmicks. So that's where we're at number 2. Basically, the transitional period between the golden age of the WWF, when the WWF was at its height at WrestleMania 3, to which they show the whole angle unveiled. Andre the Giant, Hulk Hogan, Piper's Pit, Andre ripping the chain. They show it all when it comes to that. And Stephanie McMahon mentions, as a little girl, she felt jealous because people would give the credit all the way to Hulk Hogan and none to her father, Vince McMahon. But Vince McMahon designed it that way, guys. Vince McMahon designed it so that he was not the center of attention. Because to the casual wrestling viewer, we watch wrestling every week. A lot of us didn't even know that Vince McMahon was the owner of the WWF or in charge of the WWF at all. We thought, as kids, I know I did, that Jack Tunney was the man. That Jack Tunney was the guy pulling the strings. That Jack Tunney was making the decisions, not Vince McMahon. We perceive Vince McMahon as just the announcer because that's the way he wanted it. You know what I mean? So for her to say, oh, well, I was jealous my dad wasn't getting the kind of attention that he should have gotten. Well, he didn't want that. You know what I mean? But as the trial comes and all these scandals come and people start to watch other programs like Inside Edition, Hard Copy, the Phil Donahue Show, the Geraldo Rivera Show, and the local news, especially in New York City where I live, we start to say, wait a minute, Vince McMahon is the owner of the WWF. What's going on? So that's what this part of the documentary is talking about. Anyway, guys, just a brief overview. I think this is the real juicy part. This is the part where they're leading to the crescendo, which eventually they'll talk about, the Janelle Grant situation, Vince McMahon having to resign in 2022. But we're getting to that, and now we're getting to the heat of it, the Monday Night Wars. Going to be and talking about all the jumps, beginning with Lex Luger jumping from WWF to WCW, and Luger's failed run in the WWF, not failing to win the championship from Yokozuna at SummerSlam 1993, and getting to Macho Man also making the jump, and eventually Scott Hall and Kevin Nash making the jump as well, forming the NWO, and WCW beginning to kick WWE's ass for 83 weeks in the ratings. That's probably what they'll talk about next time. The hard years of WWE. Peace, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see my next videos coming out.